Welcome to the Sport and Crypto podcast, where we talk to leaders in Web3 and sports. Joining me on today's episode, all the way from down under, is Ridley Plummer, Tennis Australia Senior Manager, Digital Sales and Metaverse. I'm hoping I've got that job title correct, Ridley. How are you?
Good, thanks, mate. How are you?
Really well, really well. So why don't you tell us, what does that job title mean?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. Look, in its simplest form, I sit within our commercial team and within that commercial team in the audience team. And my role is essentially to use innovation, new products and new technology to grow our audience in relation to tennis or the AO more holistically. So yeah, ultimately innovation, audience, and then commercialize that audience down the track as well. And that could be through direct sales to that consumer base or consumer, or through our partners in market at the moment. So how do we open up more sponsorship opportunities for our existing partners or new partners as well? So yeah, it's an exciting one and comes with lots of new ideas and challenges.
Let's backtrack a little bit and talk about your journey up until this point. Why don't you give the audience a bit about you and your background and what led you to go down this route in your career?
So I started at tennis about 7 years ago. I came into a sort of a creative business development role within the organisation, and I spent about three and a half years in that role in particular. And then myself had a bit of a background in collecting cards, for example, or basketball cards, baseball cards, etc. And then when sort of the crypto side of things in 2017, 2018 was really heating up, and then 2020, 2021 through COVID, sort of the NFT craze was going wild. I was sort of getting a bit into it personally, and then I guess was able to migrate my role a little bit internally at tennis, where a couple of the senior executives came to me and sort of said, look, we know you're dabbling around in this space as a bit of a hobby. Are you interested in taking on a role internally that is largely focused on new technology? And so I sort of said, yep. And they said, right, you start tomorrow, clean out the rest of your rest of your work and move across straight away. And that was sort of, I think that was probably late 2020, right, sort of in the middle of sort of COVID time. So not without its challenges, a lot of working from home at the time. And then, yeah, we kind of rolled straight into a few big projects.
What got you interested in that space? When you say you were dabbling yourself, what was the interest for you as an individual?
I think it was seeing how technology was advancing really quickly and what was available to, I guess, it was probably me personally, what was available from a technology standpoint and what could I learn from that. And I think whenever you're looking at a lot of that tech personally, you've probably got your work hat on at the same time. And so for me, as Tennis Australia and as a rights holder, I think we're always thinking about what we can do with that technology to stand out from anyone else that's also looking at it, or just to stand out in amongst a lot of other sports that are all pushing the boundaries on innovation, technology, creativity, audience growth, different platforms, etc. So how do I pair a little bit of what I'm interested in my personal life with what I'm doing in my business life as well?
And can you recall one thing or one project, one announcement that really captivated your attention as an individual, but that you were like, wow, I need to go tell my boss about this? I'll give you an example. So when we had in season one, I think when we were talking to Tarek, who used to work at Adidas, now at Trace, he talks about how Bored Apes were just kind of like this unlock in the brain of like the decentralization of the commercial IP aspect. And so I'm wondering if there was anything specific that really spoke to you that meant, wow, I've got to go take this above board and say, we need to look into this seriously.
Yeah, it was for sure. Top Shot was like NBA Top Shot was the closest thing that I could see to what I had done with my collecting as a kid, like back in the 90s. Sort of everyone was going wild for basketball cards, and we would trade them at school, etc. So that was kind of the natural progression that I saw, but it was the speed at which you could I guess, trade, work a marketplace, collect, build a collection, and then retrade, etc. So always with the aim of sort of building a collection of different cards from a team or a player or a specific type. So that was really interesting. And I think there was 3 or 4 of us at the office that were getting up at 3 or 4 in the morning to get into the drops because they weren't really favourable to us in Australia. So there was a lot of early nights and you'd wake up, you'd jump in the waiting room I think they had and then wait to see if you got into the drop or not. And then we'd discuss it at the office the next day. And we were sort of looking at the model of how that potentially worked for tennis while that was launching or sort of growing as well. Not that we necessarily wanted to be just a follower in that market. I think what we wanted to do was potentially look at how we could use the technology and what was available to us to do something different and something very out of the box that no one else had thought of or no one else had considered, because everyone was looking at collectibles in the sense of they have to be an image of something or someone or a moment. So that was our opportunity to sort of think outside the box a little bit.
At that moment, right, in that kind of time period, I remember genuinely having conversations with people in your positions in other kind of sports organizations who were like, hey, Beeple sold this NFT for $69 million. How do we do something similar? And you're like, what do you mean? That's like, it's asking like, oh, Picasso just sold this painting for a lot of money. Like, how do we go do that? It's like, you're a brand, you're a rights holder. Like, that's never going to happen. And so to that end, how frothy was the market at that point when the NFT hype really started ramping up and you must have had a ton of inbound and a ton of things pitched at you? Was it quite a difficult market to maneuver at that point?
I think we were in a really fortunate position that the timing that we had with respect to the AO and our event, which is sort of 3 weeks in January, and our business is hyper-focused around that event, meant that we were kind of riding this wave of how, I guess, frothy was the word that you mentioned, how frothy the market was, but also matching that with the appetite internally of the business to do something in that space. And I think that's where the business sees opportunity to innovate really well. But we only have that really small window in the year to make a big noise about it, because as soon as the AO is done, everyone moves on to either the next tournament, the next Grand Slam, the Formula One, whatever other event might be coming up next in Melbourne. But also globally, everyone turns their eyes to something else. Like it's, I think, Super Bowl this coming weekend or a couple of weeks ago, and this podcast goes live, but everyone's turned their focus to Super Bowl straight away. So if we didn't get in January, we would have to wait another 12 months. So I think it was, it must have been January of 2021, I think, from memory, that we launched the ArtBall. And then, everything kind of went crazy from there, which was really, I guess, exciting, but also a little bit unknown at the same time. I think we were exploring a space that no one had really explored before. And that was a little bit scary in a sense, but we had a great team behind it that were also passionate about what we were doing, and everyone was incredibly committed to what we were doing. And I think we were all just running so fast that we just managed to break down any barriers really quickly, and we took people on the journey, and all of a sudden we'd created this amazing product that ended up winning numerous awards and kind of setting a new standard for what you could do with the technology, particularly from a rights holder perspective.
Let's talk a little bit about AO ArtBall. Why don't you give the audience who don't know about it a high-level run-through about what the project was?
Yeah, so essentially the ArtBall was a rendered 3D tennis ball that was wrapped in a digitally created artwork. Each of those artworks were completely unique. The first collection was 6,776 balls, which I guess was built out of the way that we then divided the court. So The ball itself, yes, that was the NFT or the collectible, but we needed something else to engage the consumer and kind of gamify that collection. So like I mentioned with basketball cards, you build a collection of that particular card or that player or that team. For us, it was about gamifying watching tennis and getting a new audience to turn on the TV and watch the match in the hope that their ball might become a winning ball. So we divided the court into perfectly equal parcels and then attributed each of those balls to one of those parcels. So each parcel was about 17 centimeters by 17 centimeters. And we used chain link technology to completely randomly distribute the balls across the court. And then throughout the tournament, whatever ball or plot you owned, that was your plot through the tournament. And then we used some 3D ball tracking data that took the last match winning point of each match and tracked that to the point on the court at which that match winning point landed. And then we would take the data from that match and upload it to that particular ball. So if you had the match winning ball for a Djokovic versus Nadal match, depending on the winner, the court position, the location, the score, the timing of the match in the tournament, you would have all that data then attributed to your ball on chain for I guess the life of that product or the ball. And that could be multiple wins or it could be no wins as well. So we had balls that had 3 wins on them in the first year or two, which were just in positions that found themselves attracting match-winning shots.
People may listen to this now or watch this now and think like, oh, that doesn't seem that crazy to do. But actually, at the time, it was pretty out there and innovative. Like the data aspect, the data to NFT date aspect, the parcel of the core. It must have been a huge undertaking and also very challenging to do with the technology available at the time.
Yeah, it definitely was a challenge, particularly the time frame that we had to do it in was incredibly tight. I think we onboarded the idea in probably late November. We then began building in early December and basically built nonstop with the team, whether that was the brand of ArtBall, the graphics that went on the ball, how they were represented in reality, then the technology, embedding the technology to make sure that it was reliable and that we were actually getting the correct data, and then everything through marketing, PR, comms, etc. basically all got squashed into like a 6-week window.
That's crazy.
It was pretty wild. We worked essentially completely through Christmas, New Year's, and then launch, I think, on the 12th of January, I think it was. So we really only had sort of a 6 or 7 week lead time to go from essentially what was a groundbreaking concept to getting it live. And fortunately, it launched with almost without a hitch at all. We were basically at the mercy of the Ethereum blockchain when we launched because gas fees were high. There was so much demand on not just the chain itself, but also our product. So when we launched, we sold out in like less than 3 minutes. So you can imagine we were all pretty blown away by how fast that came to life. And then the way that it launched and the success that it launched with, I guess we had a lot of momentum to run with straight out the gate.
And what was the reception like from, people internally, fans and collectors?
I think everyone was pretty blown away by what we created in such a short space of time. Like the team internally, when we kind of went back to senior management and said, we just sold 6,776 balls in 3 minutes and almost crashed kind of the biggest blockchain in the world, they were pretty amazed. I think the team puts a lot of trust in, I guess, myself or anyone else in a role within the innovation team to use technology responsibly, but also make sure that whenever we build infrastructure around that technology, it has to be appropriately built to cater for an audience that could be a huge audience. So whether that be with NFTs or blockchain or AI, crypto, even on-site, when you talk to the bones of an event, you need the infrastructure to cater for hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people that are coming through the event. People don't like waiting in lines. They don't like slow service. They like the natural things that we don't like in everyday life. We had to cater for that sort of stuff when designing the product as well. So I think because everything worked pretty seamlessly in a world where you could have hits and misses quite easily, the reception from the consumer and collectors was pretty resounding as well. And I think the level of technology and the integration of the ball going under the court and then an additional, I guess, AI or ball tracking data plugging into that as well kind of gave, I guess, your more traditional tech fans or Web3 fans a whole nother layer and level of information and technology to look into as to how we were doing it. And people were sort of trying to crack the code of how we had built the system in the way that we did.
And talk us through some of the benefits that these holders got, because it wasn't just a piece of art. This acted as a gateway to much more than that to some extent.
Yeah, so after launch, we took off to NFT NYC. So first year, we just really launched, and it was a big focus on, I guess, the gamification aspect of it. Own the ball, try and achieve a winning match point. That was, in its most simple form, that was pretty much it. So then we went to NFT NYC and we held a number of events there, which were great because we got to meet some real loyal holders who had multiple balls, who'd been in sort of from day one and were really interested. We've also got great access to other rights holders. So we held an event at the New York Mets game. We had a private clinic with Stan Smith, so as in Stan Smith from Adidas. We then had a number of other events with hotels that are partners of ours. So we had a big launch party at the W in New York. And so that was sort of the first part of, okay, we can use this as a bit of a private members club in a way. So as we got closer then to, I think it must have been AO 23 at this stage, we basically announced that everyone who owned an art ball would be able to claim 2 7-day ground passes to the AO. So with a value of about $300 for that. So we had around 2,000 claims made in the first year. Second year, we also did that and had about 1,500 to 2,000 redeemed again. In that second year, we also worked on what we called the equivalent match point ticket. So if you had a match point winning ball from the AO previous, you could claim the equivalent tickets for that match. So
oh, wow, okay.
If it was an outside court, say court 10, you could claim that for a ground pass. But that went right through to men's and women's finals. So I think we had about 400 odd tickets claimed in that instance, where they would be anything from a $49 ground pass up to probably an $800 or $900 men's final ticket as well, and then everything in between. So I think we were able to work, I guess, creatively on how we used the tech and the platform to reward the holders as well.
And since then, the program's been wound down from what I understand. And I'd love to kind of hear you talk through that. One of the things I found really, really weird was just some of the backlash off the back of it, which was kind of like, oh, you know, these NFTs that used to be worth this much money are now worth zero. Like, haha, told you so. And I remember looking at that being like, they do know that they probably, you know, some people must have bought these things for like $200, $300 and maybe gotten $3,000 worth of value from them. Of course, people have been buying them at different points, but you as the original issuer can only sell them at a specific price point and then give value off the back of that. And the resale is kind of out of your control. Why don't you talk us through that? Because there hasn't been any, well, I say any, but there hasn't been many kind of like winding down of operations of any campaign or project from a Web3 perspective. And I'd love to kind of hear the thinking around why it happened, how you decided to roll that out, and then maybe if you had any surprise about the some of the headlines.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and look, it was tough to see some of that pushback and feedback, because we feel like there's been an enormous amount of value attributed to the balls. Yes, to an element, it is an experiment in new technology as well. And it never actually was designed to go beyond 1 year, to be honest. When we first designed it, it was meant to be that one AO and really gamified. There was never any intent to do tickets or benefits on the back of it. That was something that we sort of created as an ongoing reward. But what we also found as we kept building the project and kept innovating and pushing out tickets and merch packs and events and everything is that it actually becomes really expensive to run the project. So we don't just sort of click our fingers and tickets appear in my hand and I distribute them to everyone. There's a whole lot of lines of costs that come with those. We don't need to get into the gory details of that, and similarly with events, merch packs, and then also the technology. So using the technology to, I guess, take that ball tracking and then attribute that to every single shot or every match point during the AO is actually a really laborious task for someone to do through that period. So we have the access to the technology. We then need to audit and QC essentially every match point to ensure that it is legitimately on that plot. So there's about 500 odd matches that we follow through the tournament that all have to be audited. And then there's the construction of the back end and everything that happens around there, because the technology is changing all the time. So we're not still working with the same infrastructure that we were 3 years ago when we built it. So that all needs to be reinvented each year. So between all of those, cost becomes a big factor, but also we saw the audience shrinking significantly. So you remember when I sort of started the conversation, 2 or 3 of my main KPIs are using innovation to grow audience. And if that audience is shrinking, then we need to look at what other innovations we can use to continue growing new audiences. So that's been a big factor in sort of making the decision. The decision is not necessarily mine to make, but senior management came to me a couple of months ago and said, we think it's time to sort of put the project into a hibernation phase. So the way that we have hibernated the project is in a way that it can come back at any stage. So the infrastructure is still there. We can turn it back on at any point.
I think it's a really kind of sensible way to kind of articulate that. Is it not a reflection on you folks, but generally speaking, I think we saw a lot of NFT projects, kind of more crypto native ones, struggle to find a business model for what they were building, right? They sold NFTs and then said, oh, now we've got to do something. and actually there are some that have done, Pudgy Penguin's a really good example, building out a real world business model beyond the IP that they've created and then trying to capture value and reattribute it towards that IP is very, very difficult to do, but they're one of the few that have done it. I think Yuga Labs, although they raised a ton of money, have also tried to build a bunch of stuff that kind of tries to do the same thing. And I'm sure a few other NFT projects have done the same. Is that something that became apparent to you as well internally at the AO, where you're kind of looking at this and saying, well, actually, like the revenue source has happened and we don't want to extract any more value from this audience, but we are constantly plowing value into this audience to service it, to make sure that the revenue that we extracted in the first place is worthwhile for them?
You're right. It's a thing, it's a conversation that we've been having for probably 2 years now is there a legitimate commercial business case around the use of the technology and the platform that we built? And I think to some extent exactly what you've described. You have this huge injection of cash, and then quite quickly that depletes. And eventually, within probably a year or two, that cash is gone. And you need to look at commercially what that means for the business. And like you said, we sort of plow value into it where we can, but at some point we probably need to look at it from a business standpoint and look at what makes sense and what doesn't, and where we could better use funds or technology to continue to grow new audiences. So that's kind of a bit of a direction change that we've taken in the last 12 months or so is, okay, we need to continue to use technology and be an experimenter and a game changer in that way, that we want others to come on that journey with us. And if people are going to look at us as an innovator and a true innovator in this, the rights holder world or the sporting world or even the tech world, we need to be pushing the boundaries on what's possible and trialing stuff. And I think you need to not be afraid to fail occasionally as well. You can't hit a home run every time, but we like to think that we probably hit more home runs than we strike out.
And I don't think it because it ended up having to close, you can necessarily call it a failure, right? I think that if you look at it in that aspect, that every company that has ever existed is a failure, because it ends up, getting to its peak and then kind of like plateauing and probably becoming nothing in the end. That's what happens to 99.9999% of companies, and even some of the biggest that have ever existed. That's happened to them. I think where you run into some stumbling blocks when it comes to things built on blockchain, and especially in this kind of crypto space and the emerging technology space, is that the timelines are so hyper compressed, and so what you talked about doing in that 6-week period in 2021, it would still probably take you 6 weeks now, just on different, better tech and different distribution channels and so on and so forth. But on top of that, the business model has changed. Like, there is not that many people now who are just simply selling digital content to an audience, taking that money in and then doing nothing from it. I mean, maybe in a different way. We've seen Donald Trump launch a meme coin and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, it's very difficult to do that. I wanted to ask you, is there anything you would have done differently in retrospect for the AO ArtBall project?
That is a great question. I think everything moved so quickly in that period when we were building that it was almost like if someone had a good idea, let's action it. I think what we didn't necessarily understand was what might this look like 3, 5, 10 years down the track, because we were just moving so quickly. We were looking at that one event. The event's coming up in 8 weeks. How do we get ready for that? And then what do we do off the back of that? That's probably the one thing, was we might have been a little bit short-sighted in some sense, but I think we were moving so quickly towards that event that we didn't really have another option. We had the blessing of all the big decision makers internally, whether that was from comms or legal or whatnot, to move forward with the project. And we did the appropriate due diligence that we could at the time. But I think that was a challenge, but also moving fast like that breeds amazing creativity. So the ideas that were coming out of Zoom calls at 9 p.m. at night with a team partly in Australia and partly in Europe and partly in the US were unreal. Like, it was, I've never sat in physical brainstorms that the ideation that was coming through these Zoom calls from people that were just genuinely so excited and pumped about the project. So I think when we look back, we did amazing things. We got the project to amazing heights. We won awards for it. We can put ourselves against or up with, I guess, the biggest organizations in the world as far as creativity goes from a use of technology perspective. And I'm really proud of the team that created it. and got it to market in the way that we did. So I don't think there's necessarily too much to regret there at all.
Before we move on to part 2, where we look at the future a little bit more, I'm happy to remind you that this podcast is sponsored by the HBAR Foundation. The most beloved sports brands understand that what fans want is simple, a reason to be passionate. The HBAR Foundation enables brands and fans to share their passion on-chain using the Hedera network, the most used sustainable enterprise-grade DLT for the decentralized economy. Visit linkedin.com/company/HBAR Foundation to learn more and get the latest HBAR Foundation and Hedera network news. This podcast is also supported by Credenza. Credenza harnesses blockchain technology to power a real-time data synchronization platform that transforms customer data ecosystems. They make data more relevant and actionable for sports brands, teams, leagues, and IP owners. Find out more at credenza3.com. Let's move to the present and future a little bit more, because time flies, and we were just talking about something that happened in 21, 22 and 23, and we're in 2025 now. How crazy is that? What is Australian tennis doing right now in the space?
Great question. I think we're always looking at what's new, what's coming. And I guess the big thing for us right now is how we use AI. AI is obviously in the news over the last sort of 6 to 12 months for all sorts of reasons. But it's not something that's necessarily new to us as an organization. We've been using AI in tennis for about 10 to 15 years now, whether it be calling the lines on the courts or actually moving the lines people off the court to call the lines in real time. So the use of different technologies and what is available to us in the market is really important, that we're always kind of at the bleeding edge of what we can do and how we can continue to grow tennis using technology. So yeah, AI is kind of right in our wheelhouse at the moment, along with a few other bits and pieces that we're working on.
What about on the more blockchain side? Is there anything that you're seeing or anything that's been tempting for you as an organization to pursue again?
Yeah, look, sponsorship's been a huge opportunity for us in that space. I think we, as an organization, we've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different brands. And I think what's really important for us is, if we're going to bring a sponsor on board, or a payment solution or a blockchain or an exchange, it needs to add value to our consumer experience. I think everything that we do, either at the AO or for an audience watching globally or involving themselves with the event globally, has to add value to their experience rather than just be a logo on a shirt, for example. So the conversations that we've had haven't really come to fruition yet, but because we haven't felt that anyone's been able to bring that value to the consumer. So I think as we continue to have those conversations, we push really hard on those conversations that we're having to come to us with ideation around how we can use the technology for better, either for the consumer or for tennis more holistically. So there's a few little things in the works at the moment around how that comes to life, but hopefully we see something pop up in the next sort of 12 months before AO 26.
What would be the idea? I know you can't go into too much detail, but like, what is some of the things that you want to do with one of these partners? Like, what are the, without putting your absolute finger on it, but like, people talk about Web3 loyalty programs, they talk about ticketing. Like, where do you see the opportunity being for you folks, 12 months from now?
Yeah, look, you took a couple of answers right out of my mouth there. Like, loyalty is a big play, right? We've got a huge audience globally, but we are also very hyper-focused in Melbourne. And for that reason, people coming to the event more often than not are going to be from Melbourne or local in Victoria. So can they get the loyalty out of a product? That's sort of a question that we have to answer. Ticketing is obviously a massive one for us. We have a great relationship with Ticketmaster, who are our preferred partner in that space. But that's not to say that we're getting knocks on the door pretty regularly from from other platforms who are building their own ticketing solutions. We also have other events that we run, not just around Melbourne or Victoria, but around Australia as well. So how do we look at potentially using some of these technologies in sort of like a trial phase? We also have AO Startups, which is an internal, I guess, startup hotbed for new companies, new and emerging companies and technologies to utilize some of their technology that they have available in-house within Tennis Australia or the Australian Open. So we've got a number of conversations going on through that platform right now with different either Web3 based organizations or more holistically tech-based organizations. And some of the stuff that they're working on is pretty amazing. But yeah, I think we need to think creatively about how do we use blockchain or Web3 for tennis more holistically. Is it something to do with scoring? Is it something to do with player points, player standings? I think there's something there. I think when you pair it with the consumer experience, like we did with ArtBall, I think there's got to be something for the consumer in there as well. Likely with gamification, I think. So yeah, I think once we continue to sort of build out those ideas, something will come to the forefront, and all of a sudden someone will have that idea and just go, oh, why didn't we think of that 3 years ago?
And off the back of that, how different have some of the conversations been with exchanges and chains now compared to 21, 22, even 23?
They have been different, definitely. I think it's probably been on us to put a bit of pressure on them. Obviously, the fees and the dollars that they were throwing around 2 or 3 years ago aren't necessarily there right now. I think back in 21, 22, everything was flying and we were seeing huge sponsorships signed with major rights holders and events and different sporting codes. And I think tennis didn't necessarily reap the benefits of that, but we didn't really go looking for it too much, I don't think. I think our audience was probably not necessarily quite what the big brands and the big exchanges were looking for. Tennis typically skews a little bit older and probably more 50-50 male-female, whereas a lot of those conversations were based around wanting a 25 to 30-year-old male. And like, how do we get them? We just don't have an enormous audience in that demographic. However, that's shifting significantly now. So the audience base is getting younger. There are more affluent audience base. We're now starting to skew slightly more male than female. So the conversations have changed, particularly around the use of the technology and bringing sponsors to that audience or bringing that audience to the sponsors. And I think that's where we need to talk about that value translation of, if we're just going to put a logo on a wall or build an activation at an event, it needs to have some value for the consumer, whether that be on site, on broadcast, in their home, in the way that data is consumed, in the way that data is presented. There's a lot of opportunity for us to do something creative there. And we're going to continue to push back on brands that just want a logo slap. That's not really the business that we're in.
Well said. I wanted to ask you about something big that you've launched recently, Beyond Tennis. Really, really interesting project. I would love for you to give us an overview on that, because I think it's a sneaky big deal in the industry. I don't know how much media attention it got, but I certainly remember when you sent it to me thinking, yeah, this is pretty out there and pretty interesting. So give the audience a bit of an overview about what Beyond Tennis is.
Beyond Tennis is essentially the world's first AI-generated tennis league. So we'd been chatting with a local company based out of Melbourne, One Future Sport, who had this idea for football. And that idea was to basically create a AI-generated platform that was run like a league where you could follow along players and there was storytelling. And so after they built out that, we looked at what it could be for tennis. And in the time that from the time that they built One Future Football right through to now, AI has changed significantly in that time. It's got incredibly smarter. It's way more realistic. You can teach it more. It'll learn faster. So we kind of got to the drawing board, and we had a much longer lead time than we had for ArtBall. So we could actually think about all the ins and outs of how this worked. And so Beyond Tennis in its core is an intersection of sport, social media, and gamification. So we see the sport of tennis, storytelling playing out on social media, and then the gamification aspect of you as a consumer taking on the role of a coach or mentor to a player. And that player is completely AI generated, but for all intents and purposes, they look and feel completely real. They have their own social platforms that you can follow. Their stories are real. They're in real locations, taking real photos, posting real content. And then they communicate with you on a one-to-one basis within the app. So whichever player you choose to coach learns a bit about you. They know your name. They're going to start to learn your tendencies in what you prefer from them and how you like to communicate with them and how they should be communicating with you. And then all of that plays out in tennis. So we taught an engine how to play tennis. We put about 300 or 400 matches into it and basically said, you need to create a non-bias result based on 120 data inputs about that player. And that could be their forehand skill, their backhand skill, their drop shots, their volleys, their fitness, their mental health, their off-court habits, their on-court habits. We've essentially built a profile about all these players that then the engine learns and plays matches on their behalf. And then you as the coach get to influence their skill sets. So that's the gamification aspect of it as well.
Is this natively in the app, or is it a standalone application?
It's a standalone application, so you can download in the iOS store or Google Play under Beyond Tennis. And then essentially you'll move straight into that experience of selecting your player, and then you become the coach straight away. They're going to start communicating with you straight off the bat. And then everything takes place in that app. So from a tournament mode to matches to little mini games, conversations, skill upgrades, basically the entire coaching platform that you'll be taking part in takes part in the app. And then if you want to leave that app, you can go to the social media platforms of those players and see the decision-making that you've had an impact on play out on their channels. So when you're coaching them, they'll be asking you things about what they should eat, where they should travel, what they should purchase, elements of their mental health, what they should be doing to improve that. And then the decisions that you make, along with all the other coaches that are coaching that player, then plays out in storytelling. So a decision today might be, should I finished the tournament in Melbourne, should I head back home to Switzerland or should I go to Dubai? If I go to Switzerland, I'm going to go skiing in the Swiss Alps. If I go to Dubai, I'm going to sit on the beach or go shopping. So 2 days later, you'll then see the results of that decision making. Your player will either be skiing in the Swiss Alps or sitting on a beach in Dubai.
There's a lot of crossover right now in the kind of crypto, digital asset space and AI. It just seems like some are saying hype begets hype and hype meets hype, but others are calling it a match made in heaven. I'm kind of more towards the latter than the former. Is there room for digital assets to be integrated into something like this where there is not a dependency on player IP? Talk me through that side of things.
That's a great question. Absolutely. The short answer is absolutely. It could play a huge part in a platform like this. So you mentioned player IP. One of the reasons that we have created the platform is because we get to use that IP and experiment with it in the way that we can't do with normal players. Normal players are a very protected species. They have to play tennis. They have their obligations to their sponsors and their management teams, etc. And they can only communicate en masse with an audience. It's very difficult for them to communicate one-to-one with consumers or fans. So because we've created these AI-generated players, they can communicate with tens of thousands of people in an instant in a very personalized fashion. And then we get to experiment with what's available to us in that sense. So how do we make it as hyper-realistic as possible? Or is it more like a Tamagotchi where you just press a few buttons and keep your player alive? And the Tamagotchi example has been really relevant while we've been talking about the platform. It's the complexity of fantasy football. So if you want to get into all the data and it's all there available to you, and you want to really dive into what your player's doing and where their weaknesses and strengths are, you can do that. But if you just want to chat with your player one-on-one and kind of take them on the journey and see where they're traveling and check their results, you can do that too. So then from a technology standpoint, I think the ability for us to blend those two worlds of Web3 or blockchain with AI becomes really interesting. So I mentioned earlier on about that sort of foresight of we were only looking a few weeks or months ahead with ArtBall. We're now looking 2 or 3 years ahead with Beyond Tennis. So it has all been built in a way that could go on-chain very easily. It's also been built in a way that we have narrative and the ability to build out the stories of the players a year or 2 years from now. We will have players that retire, players that will get injured. We'll have new players coming through, the ability for you to take on a new player. We have players coming in from everywhere over the world. So if you're in the UK, I'm in Australia, we've got fans in India, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina. We're bringing in players from all of these countries around the world. So the ability for us to create local heroes in environments that haven't otherwise had that tennis hero becomes an interesting story as well. So we talk about the Yao Ming effect on the NBA sort of 15 odd years ago when he came in from China, and the growth and the rapid growth of NBA and basketball in China that had. Can we use technology to kind of recreate a similar scenario for tennis? And ultimately, we see it as a bit of a rising tide lifts all ships moment for tennis more holistically. Like, this is not an AO branded or Tennis Australia branded product. This is a product that brings more audience to tennis. We want people to engage with tennis year round in a very one-on-one personalized fashion, and moving more from that passive to active involvement in the sport. So even though they're not necessarily picking up a racket and getting out on court and playing, they're still involving themselves in the sport as opposed to just sitting on the couch and watching. They can actually have an impact and influence on the story.
The hyper-personalization aspect is really interesting. We talked about it a lot on the show so far about using kind of blockchain loyalty to enable that, right? Knowing your fans a lot better because you have on-chain credentials that say Ridley is X age and is from Australia and really loves this sport and this player and also enjoys these brands and also likes watching this TV show because we've integrated so many different partners and sponsors into this one holistic viewpoint to then serve them best. There are some markets that will tell you that kind of hyper-personalization aspect is not a fad, but diminishing returns in the sense that you might get better attribution from just an email blast to 50 million people, right? I tend to think that sports is a bit of a different animal. Like the fandom aspect compared to like the customers of Nespresso and how you market to them is a totally different ball game, you know, pardon the pun. But I think that there is room for that. Like that kind of one-to-one interaction that a fan might crave from, you know, a Rafael Nadal or a Djokovic or Andy Murray is not going to happen in a scalable way. And so if you have something that's a little bit more automated, whether people want to talk about it being made up or not, The most hardcore players of Football Manager will play all the way until Bukayo Saka becomes a coach, and then there'll be loads of made up players that they're coaching in their team. And part of that is a bit strange, but actually because they get to influence their story and their narrative and their growth, that's what they love about that game. And even if they take the kind of existing players and how they can kind of influence their growth and trajectory, that's part of why they, like, millions and millions of people play these games. So I guess you're taking a bit from column A, B, and C to kind of create this thing that is this, gamified AI platform that could integrate, some of the on-chain mechanisms that we've talked about to add ownership to the hyper-personalization and add kind of like value attribution and creation to the hyper-personalization as well.
Absolutely. That's all really important points that you've made there. I think the hyper-personalization aspect of even the communication channel that we have within the platform is a really interesting use case, because as a brand, we have multiple channels of communication with a consumer, and the way that we use that going forward is going to be really important, and how we use it strategically. And we don't just bombard people with promotions or benefits like you currently receive EDMs and text messages from every other brand in the world. We've actually now starting to build a one-to-one relationship with the consumer. So as you mentioned earlier on, we start to learn things about that consumer and their likes and their dislikes and how they interact within the platform. So I think there's going to be a massive opportunity for us and partners in the future. I think we want to make sure that if partners are coming on board, again, like I mentioned, they need to add value to the consumer. So we've got Infosys on board as the presenting rights partner, and obviously they bring the technology that we have available to us as well. But then if we were to onboard, say, a shoe company as a major sponsor of Beyond Tennis, what is the benefits that company can give to the consumers that are coaching players? Is it limited edition releases? Is it early access to new releases? Is it discounts? Is it freebies? Is it competitions? That, I think, becomes a really interesting use case for the technology. And yes, it's an auxiliary factor of the use of the technology, but it's something very different to how marketers are thinking right now. I think they're still thinking very one-dimensionally around social media, EDMs, text messages. How do we just blast as many people as possible and keep our name front and center? But it lacks that hyper-personalization that we're talking about.
Yeah, and to some extent, like, marketers have always had to go to where the audience already is. And we're seeing a lot of people shift budgets from social to Roblox and Fortnite. But it's a bit of say goodbye to the old boss, meet the new boss to some extent, in the sense that you're still investing a ton of money into something. It's for a specific demographic, and the data attribution you get is pretty limited. And you might be hot, top of the charts for a little while, and then kind of back down. And it's difficult to kind of create that flywheel when there's so many competitive games and worlds within these platforms, right? Even though they are absurd in terms of their kind of user metrics and growth and so on and so forth. I wanted to ask you about some of the metrics that you guys have seen with Beyond Tennis. Are you able to share some of the kind of success and headline stats that you had so far?
Yeah, I haven't got any stats at hand, but yeah, look, it's been a great launch for us. I think we never intended it for it to be used by millions of people straight off the bat. I think we want to launch it and grow the platform. And I think for that reason, we only launched with the ability to coach 5 players. We have intent to build 48 players into the league and have them represent 8 teams. Ideally, down the track, we have all those teams being owned by a sponsor. We have sponsors sharing content from those teams. We have players that have personal sponsorships. And then we have, ultimately down the track, I would love to have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of players globally coaching these athletes and influencing that story. I think that's what becomes really important, is the connection between you making a decision and then seeing that decision play out. although it might not always be in the favor of what you wanted, you might prefer that your athlete goes skiing in the Swiss Alps. But I think that becomes really interesting for a little bit of human psyche. So we've only sort of been in market for about 2.5 weeks now. We've got thousands of users on board playing and coaching at the moment. So we're starting to see enough data flow through that decision-making is being influenced by the consumer. And then how we build our engines, and we teach the narrative engine to tell better stories, and we teach the tennis engine to play more realistic tennis. And then underpinning that is going to be how we visually bring this to life for the consumer. So right now, the technology is not quite there to showcase highlights or matches in reality as close as possible, but I don't think we're far away.
We're not.
I also don't think we're looking at an audience who's going to sit there and watch 3 hours of AI-generated tennis. They might watch 60 seconds of highlights. So if we can get to a point where our players are playing highlights of shots and match-winning points, etc., and celebrating, and then doing press conferences, which we can do right now. We've got players that are speaking in press conferences that look and feel as real as any other press conference. I think once we get to that point, like, the world's our oyster in creating amazing new content 24/7, 365. I think that's what's really important to us with creating a platform like this, is the always on mentality of our business and how we bring tennis to the world, which is a very, very small and ever shrinking environment, in a 24/7, 365 space where you could get a message from your player right now, or you could get one while you're sleeping because they're in Switzerland and you're in Australia and it's the middle of the night. So it's kind of nice to wake up and check your phone and see, oh, my player has messaged me, they need something, or they've got a question, or they're going to send me some photos of what they're up to. And you get that little bit of self-satisfaction that you naturally get when your phone pings and it's a friend on the end of your line, or someone's seeing if you want to catch up, or sending you a text or whatnot. So I think we've got some really interesting psyche to play with there as well.
Well, look, like, that was awesome, and it looks really exciting. I'm really particularly interested to see how the kind of like other technological aspects play into it, like, the on-chain stuff we talked about. I've got a few quick fire ones to wrap things up for you if you're ready. If you're a rights holder other than yourself that hasn't done much in this space, in the kind of more blockchain Web3 side of things, where would you start?
It's a great question. I think you've just got to start. I think in its simplest form, just start. Or if you can't start yourself, if you're not in the role that is necessarily responsible for that, start exploring. Like, download Roblox, go and try and buy an NFT off OpenSea, open a crypto account on an exchange, buy some Bitcoin, whatever it happens to be. I think you can experiment a little bit with lots of reward and little risk. So I think there's also an opportunity for people to talk to their kids or their nieces or nephews or friends. What are they doing? Are they playing Fortnite? Are they on Roblox? Are they trading digital collectibles? Are they on Discord playing around with Mid-Journey and generating images and playing with AI? Like, this is largely stuff that is freely available to us as organizations and rights holders that we need to just get out there and explore.
If you were a crypto business looking to partner with a rights holder and you were just starting out, what would your strategy be?
Oh, that's a good one. Again, like, ideas are king, right? I think if you're going to bring either an opportunity, and this works both ways. If you're a rights holder going to a brand, I think you need to bring value and ideas. If you're a brand going to a rights holder, I think you need to go with big ideas. rights holders, I think for the most part, get a lot of their ideas from external sources. And that could be agencies that they work with, other businesses and sponsors that they work with who are probably getting their ideas from agencies as well. Like, bring that big idea. Like, give someone an idea so good that they can't say no.
And then final two, what are blockchain and crypto skeptics wrong about?
It's still a technology that is in its infancy. It's ultimately going to continue to grow. I think if people look at it as though it's a fad or it's going to be over and done with in the next year or two, and it's going to have served its time and run its race, then I think they're wrong. I think the technology is still so early. It's still in this growth phase. We're still learning a lot. We're still fixing problems. We're still onboarding more people. We're finding better ways to onboard people. I think if you put your head in the sand and think it's going to go away, then you're probably taking the wrong approach. I think learn more, ask more questions, talk to people that are playing around with the technology and find out sort of why, who, what, why, when, how. It's classic, like ask questions.
This is getting like a harder one to answer as well. What do they write about? What does the space need to get better at?
Oh, look, it's probably the same answers that continue to come up in a lot of podcasts and conversations like this is onboarding. Onboarding needs improvement. I think the trust around different projects and the technology and platforms needs to improve. I think we've probably weeded out a lot of the bad news. I think also the media has a lot of responsibility in the way that they report the use of technology as well. I think you always see the negative headlines. It's pretty rare that you see the positive headlines. So that probably says a lot for your average consumer that is sitting at home reading their typical newspaper or watching their 6 o'clock news, that if they're only seeing the negative headlines all the time, then that's probably where their mentality sits. So I think there's still a lot to be done in this space. I think I'm going to go back to ideas and creativity again. Like, I think people need to continue to push the boundaries and limitations of their technology that's available to them and not be afraid to do things that people haven't done before. I think it's okay to be, it's good to be second. It's better to be first.
It's a good way to put it. Rarely happens in sport, but there we go. I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for listening or watching, whichever way you're consuming this episode. Ridley, where can people find out more about you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. Ridley Plummer is probably the best way to search me. I don't think there's too many others out there with that name. So you'll probably come across me pretty easily. But yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best one. And feel free to reach out at any stage. Always happy to have a chat or answer a few DMs.
Amazing. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the show either on your favorite podcast player or on YouTube. And also please subscribe to the newsletter, newsletter.sportingcrypto.com, or find us on our website, sportingcrypto.com. You can find me at Pet Barisha on LinkedIn mainly, or X. And just remember that none of what we have said during this show is financial or business advice, and this content is for informational purposes only. Web3 is underpinned by crypto, and crypto is volatile, meaning you can lose money if you are buying these assets personally or as a business. Where we are recording right now, in our respective countries, the majority of crypto asset companies are unregulated. So stay safe out there. Give us a review on your favorite podcast player or like this video on YouTube so we get recommended to the algorithm and more people find out about us. Thanks very much once more for listening or watching, and we'll have another episode for you soon.